Welcome to Season 4 of Bootstrapped, a Dingman Center podcast. I'm Ilana Fine.
And I'm Joe Bailey.
And today we are joined by a very special guest, Oscar Zeballos, known to many of you as Oscar Santana.
Yes. It's funny, when I met you all at the Smith School of Business, it was hard for me to say, should I tell him my on-air name or should I tell him my God-given name? And half the people know me as Oscar Santana, and half the people know me as Oscar Zeballos. And now, even on my LinkedIn, it's Oscar Santana Zeballos.
I pronounced Oscar Santana much better, so maybe we should go with that one.
I'm good with either.
Yeah. So we are thrilled to have this opportunity to have Oscar as a guest because all of our listeners know Oscar as the producer of Bootstrapped.
Yes.
And he is now not only the producer of Bootstrap, but the producer of many podcasts and the founder of the Podcast Village, which we've mentioned in a couple of our episodes. So today, we're going to get kind of the true Hollywood story of Oscar and talk a little bit more about what he's doing with his various podcasts as well as Podcast Village. Does that sound good?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love it that it's going to be an true Hollywood story.
Yeah.
Because if I remember correctly, there's either a death or some sort of tragic downfall at the end of those stories.
Not today, Oscar.
Not today.
Yes,
Not
this
today.
is the
This
true
is
Hollywood story.
sunshine and rainbows
Yeah.
and good things.
It's more of a Bloomberg 2.0 profile.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yes.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah. I'll
Okay.
go with
like
that.
that, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So join us for a Bloomberg 2.0 profile of Oscar Zeballos
All right.
or Oscar Santana. Okay, so let's jump in.
Oscar, tell us about Podcast Village.
So Podcast Village is essentially, we work for podcasters. One of the major pain points for podcasters was essentially producing a podcast, whether it be a video or audio podcast at a high level. And whether you did it at home or your basement or your friend's house or your spare room, it was always impossible to get everything just right. So the Village was born out of the idea of giving someone a turnkey solution to come and create.
So let's rewind a little bit because when we launched this podcast, Bootstrapped, one of the things that we were nervous about was that we knew nothing about podcasts. And Oscar said to us, well, you have the channels, you have the content, and the missing kind of secret sauce that makes this happen is you.
Yes.
That you knew podcasts. So walk us back a little bit to how you got into podcasting because it is such a new genre of media and communication and broadcasting.
I'm happy you actually brought that up because it was actually a hostile interaction between Ilana and Holly from the Dingman Center because I'd been hunting them down for, I would say, 6 months, and they finally said, all right, you got 15 minutes, kid. And what
15 minutes. You're lucky you got 15 minutes. Usually a pitch is just 1 minute.
That's right. We were generous.
By the way, during lunch.
Yeah.
Like that was during my lunchtime. And I said, and what was fun is because you really, the program itself, but you really taught me to say, this is who I am. This is what I've done. Right. So what I've been podcasting technically since 2005 with one of the first shows I was ever part of as a host called Big O and Dukes. And in 2005, around that time, people were walking around with this big brick, essentially an iPod. That's not the iPhone we see today. And they added a layer that said you could upload your own content. And I remember going to CBS Radio at that time in management and asking, can we put our radio show on was an iPod, iTunes, right? And they said, why would you want to do that? And I said, well, there's people that are buying these iPods and they can take the show on the go. And like any traditional business, they were threatened. We put it up anyways because we said, this will be fun. We're not hurting anybody. If anything, we're increasing our reach. Fast forward 10 years later, I'm working as a talk show host across the country in Phoenix and Baltimore and in Washington, D.C., and in the traditional sense, the big recession comes, and it's 2009, 2008, 2009, and the radio station I'm on flips to sports. And at that point, I had been doing a talk show called Big O and Dukes for 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, and they essentially wanted me to go to work at another station and play records and spin music. And I said, well, they clearly don't know what my passion is. Right. It's a big company, and that's what happens sometimes when you get into these big broadcast companies. the talent and the management really don't know who they are, right? And I believe that there's a better way. So I was lucky enough to see that there was a trend that some of these major terrestrial shows were going out on their own to distribute and produce their own programs, especially during that restructuring process when people were making multiple seven figures and they were being offered new contracts in the low six if they were lucky.
Yeah, so but look, for our listeners, this is a really important time for technology disruption, but also you have to recognize the backdrop here is the economy is not doing well at all. And, I know from our conversations in the past that we're talking about ad revenue that was drying up. We had personalities, like yourself that were on the radio that weren't able to go ahead and maybe get that big payday that they could in a very different economy. But when you had that, and the feeling in kind of 2008, 2009, if I remember, that was not the time that people wanted to make investments. They were drawing back in. They were kind of sticking to their knitting. And so the fact that you saw this technology that was out there, and I think most people kind of viewed it as maybe a hobby or a little thing on the side you can do in your basement, so why don't you? Certainly the people who are doing professional radio productions weren't looking at podcasting and embracing it, but you did.
And I think that's key to look. It's a lot of luck. It's vision. It's despair. It's it's knowing that there was still a market for great talk radio, but also understanding that if the days of owning a transmitter, an FM station, a FCC license, a physical building, if they were going away, that would mean that the overhead to actually produce content on this level was going to go down.
So I'm going to interrupt because content on this level is something that I didn't appreciate until I started getting involved with you and Bootstrapped, right? The idea that anybody can just have a recording and post it up on iTunes or something like that, not a big deal. But when you have so many podcasts that are out there, it really is important to make sure you have a quality production. But you saw that back 10 years ago now.
Yeah, you want to cut through the noise, right? And I remember the first show we launched with this concept, it's called The Mike O'Mara Show, that had a 30-year plus run as Don and Mike on terrestrial across the country. Mike, after months of, I would say 6 or 7 months of me courting him saying you should start a podcast, the first thing he says into the mic when we built his studio in his home is, "I'm not one of you." And as a business partner and a co-host, I sat there and I said, "Oh, this is not going to work out." And what he meant was, I'm not one of you in the sense that I am a professional broadcaster. This is a podcast, but we are going to treat it like a radio show, and we're going to produce on that level.
So that's a great point you made about kind of the sense that initially podcast was people just, in their basement making these, kind of with very low quality and maybe not all the right technology, doing the best they could, but this, democratization of technology tools that was happening across multiple industries. But talk to us a little bit that over, the last 5 years or 7 years, wherever you see kind of the right time frame, how has that market changed, and what are the tranches now of types of podcast, and where have you found the sweet spot, and kind of how does that tie to the podcast village concept?
That's an excellent question. So
I was trained by a good producer.
Thank you. The real tipping point was when the podcast Serial came out. Now, podcasts across the country had enjoyed phenomenal success on their own, but when Serial came out, the conversation changed from trying to explain to someone what a podcast was to essentially being able to say, "Have you heard Serial?" And they say, "Oh, yes. You can find my show right where you found Serial."
So just the way you were able to say, "We are the WeWork for podcasts," people could say, "We're the Serial for something," and all of a sudden they had context.
Because they didn't have that context and they didn't have that example before. And when that happened, Madison Avenue really took note and said, "Wow, you're telling me that we don't just have to buy from iHeart, we don't have to buy from CBS, Entercom, Cumulus. We can buy directly from these content creators, and they're producing content on such a level that millions of people are listening on their own, on demand." And we talk about the disruption of the consumption of media, and we've talked about it multiple times while we were in the executive program at Smith, is timing is everything, right? So look at what's happening right now with your ABC, your Disneys, your Hulus, your Netflix of the world. It is an arms race to own original content, right? It's the same thing is happening right now in the podcast space.
But does that mean that the advertising dollars are following as well?
Yes.
It does.
It does.
Even though there's a proliferation of content, there's still people who want to shift their spending dollars and ad budgets to podcast and streaming video.
That marketing question may be a whole separate podcast. But
Okay.
I'll say this about what I know on my marketing side, and I've been on the buying side, and I've been on the actual producing side. In my buying, I've bought ads on other shows, right? What's changed is the days of telling someone, hey, we have a reach of 50,000 people, and they are in this demographic, and they listen at the dentist, and they listen at the beauty salon or wherever it may be. Those still exist. But if you're a marketer and I'm making an ad buy with a podcast, I can show you real metrics of where people are downloading, how they're listening, how long the tail is for that content, when they're listening, without infringing on anybody's privacy. But
so the analytics layer that the podcast can provide differentiates from other places where you do ad buys. It gives you that kind of ROI.
And if you have the right connection with your audience, then this 2x that you have on terrestrial radio, for every $1 you get $2 back. I've seen podcasts get $6 back for every $1.
So let me interrupt you there, because obviously a big important part of this show is to educate on different startups and different business models. So talk about kind of the basics here. How does the business model work with a high quality podcast?
So the key is frequency.
Okay.
You have to respect your audience. You have to, if you want to do any type of show, if you are going to record it on a Wednesday and they expect it on Thursday, you have to continue delivering that content on that day before that time. For example, the Michael Mayer Show is always posted by 12 noon. And if it hasn't, there was either an earthquake or somebody had some sort of cardiac arrest. We cannot get past the fact that our listeners are counting on us. And the switching costs are so low that they could always go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. As long as we continue producing great content, we get to keep them. But most podcasters don't understand that. So they'll willy-nilly do a show here, and then when they look at their numbers and they realize, well, man, if I wanted to monetize my show, now I had an initial audience of 5,000 listeners. Now they're down to 1,000 listeners. What did I do wrong? What they did wrong is that they lost the trust of their listenership.
But when we work with startups, we talk a lot about the lifetime value of a customer, and clearly a lot of that depends upon repeat business. Alana's great at presenting this in the Smithy MBA program about get, keep, and grow, right?
Yes.
So how are you keeping? And what you're saying is that podcast listeners, to keep them, it's not the same way in which you keep a listener for a radio broadcast. They're a little more active. Their expectations are set. You have to deliver on that. You can't just do this one-off here and there podcast because you're not going to keep the people.
I think you're right. I think that
I'm happy to be wrong. I mean, I think for our listeners out there who want to understand where they should be in podcasts, this.
So first, as far as podcasting is concerned, I think there are a lot of parallels. And as I was working my way through business school, and I think a big reason why I wanted for you two to start this Bootstrapped podcast was there was multiple aha moments where I had a wall of levers that I had seen and had been working for our business. But when you go into a high-level program, you essentially get another room of levers to either treat your customers, engage with your customers, know what they want. And any podcast that's working in that same framework is working in the same framework as any other startup. It doesn't matter what you're selling. Respect your customers.
And so, because just to make sure we close the circle, so the advertisers are paying the podcaster based on number of subscribers, number of downloads,
cost per thousand.
Okay, so similar model.
Yes.
Similar advertising model. but they're for every, what would an advertiser be buying? A certain number of spots per podcast?
They would be buying a 60-second, and in this space right now, it's usually a direct response ad that is built into the fabric of the show.
Okay.
There are pre-rolls that people purchase as well, but in general, if you are listening to my voice and you're like, oh, I might want to advertise on a podcast, you have to find the right podcast that fits with your brand. If that podcast fits with your brand, you talk to their marketing team, because what's also great about owning your own business and your own show is you sit down and say, this is how we would sell this. What do you think about this aspect? You have the flexibility where it's not as cookie cutter as you would if you're just buying a national buy. Okay. It's in the podcaster's interest to, A, sign off on the product, but also talk about it, talk about their experience. Say they love their Sleep Number bed and they've had it for 20 years, or that they just ordered a Casper mattress and it was awesome getting it up to their 4th floor condo because they don't have an elevator and essentially just pushing a box up to the room and it pops open, right? Yeah. Those type of ad libs and stories are what really sell products these days. The days of just bullet points, those aren't as effective as they used to be.
But what about the fact that then the advertising dollars don't necessarily have to be there before you actually record the episode? I mean, if we have a sponsor for Bootstrapped, we could layer in some of these messages on episodes 1 through 40 now. We don't
You can sell the back catalog. Yeah. Absolutely.
But that's different, right?
That is a different animal.
So does that mean marketing dollars are on the sideline waiting for something to take off and then they can layer in?
So if you sell too early, you get locked into a CPM that is lower. And as you all know, it's harder to raise that price once you get locked in. So if you're starting a podcast, I always tell everybody to wait at least 6 months to see where your numbers are before you start talking to advertisers. Because if you start advertising too early, you'll lose money in the long run. Because what if your show takes off and you should be charging $6,000 an ad and you've been charging $600 an ad? Blue Apron isn't going to say, hey, by the way, we're going to give you $6,000 now. There's no, that negotiation isn't there.
I think some advertisers who are waiting on the wings to get into Bootstrapped, I think it's about time. Well,
yeah. I think we're ready to go.
JP Morgan Chase.
Right, exactly.
Tom Michael.
So moving away from the business model a little bit, can you talk about the content that you are producing? We know obviously the role that you've played here on Bootstrap. Can you talk about the other projects that you are involved in?
So I'm blessed, and I feel like any entrepreneur, I stuck to my knitting, as we would hear over and over again in business school, where even when I graduated, I was like, what am I going to do? And people thought I was going to leave broadcasting altogether. And some of my friends were urging me to go to a Fortune 500 company or a media company, and I had some small conversations with them. But what I realized what drove me was seeing people create and taking a concept and then seeing them as green as they can be when they walk into the studio for the very first time, and then walking out and then seeing the final product that we produced for them, and then their eyes light up and they're like, wow, I can do this, right? Essentially leveling the playing field. Mm-hmm. And the village essentially stems from that mission statement, where the reason why we ended up taking over this entire wing in Georgetown, which you know the lease prices around here, it's insane, was that I had done a small focus group for podcasting while I was in business school. I met a gentleman named Charlie Burney, and he was at the Reagan building at the focus group, and he said, would you mind coming on my podcast sometime, or can you have lunch? And we met, I would say, at least 8 different times, because I just enjoyed talking shop with him. And I said, look, Charlie, I know you have this podcast village in Gaithersburg. I have a similar concept, but on a higher level. But I'm completely packed. I'm about to get married. I'm engaged. I just bought a home. I have 2 or 3 other shows we're working on. It's the Michael Maris Show, Big O and Dukes, Tech 411, all these other programs. I cannot commit to working with you at the moment because I just don't have the bandwidth. And then I would say 9 months later, I get a knock on the door from the landlord that essentially we were subleasing our studio for, the landlord that we were subleasing our studio from, and he said, I'm moving to the first floor. You get first right of refusal. Do you want to stay here? And if you did, what would you build? And I said, how much time do I have? He goes, you have 30 days. And I said, oh, well.
I don't care about your wedding, the house, the dogs.
Yes. Let's figure this out. My first call was to Charlie. I said, Charlie, I told you I would call you if there was ever an opportunity to work together and see this vision come true and actually expand this Podcast Village brand to what we believe it can be. And the next day he came, we met, and within 10 days we had signed a lease.
So in terms of you as an entrepreneur at that point in time, it was a bit of just kind of it happened to happen, the space became available, but you also recognized that you as a scalable resource weren't very scalable. So how did you design kind of the Podcast Village to leverage the things that you could provide and recognize that, you can't produce everybody's show?
What I knew is that and we're learning as I think we're into the 16th day of this business being open, essentially, right? And we're almost sold out, which is amazing as far as the membership.
Congratulations.
Is that there are different levels of talent out there. Some talent just wants a space of their own to create. So they don't need any coaching. They don't need a show developed for them. They don't need anything except for the raw files where they can go edit in the back. They know exactly what they want to do. They have their own team. That's one type of client. The other type of client is a client that is not looking to build a podcast to sell ads on, but they're building a podcast as a brand extension of their brand. Mm-hmm. And those are the shows that really take time to develop and conceptualize and essentially coach to a place where they want their show to be as good as their brand. Mm-hmm. And whether it's JP Morgan Chase, a high-level plastic surgeon, it's Capital One, they need the product to be at a level where their customers expect it to be.
These aren't just hypotheticals. I mean, these are companies that you're working with here at Podcast Village, or are these?
So Capital One is a company we're working with. We're in talks with some other clients that are probably I'm not privy to talk about at this moment. But they are essentially high-level clients that they realize, especially on our end, that the way that our team is driven is by making sure that the people that are creating are succeeding. And I'm happy you brought this up because there are other spaces that have opened in the city, and half of those spaces, and I'm not disparaging them, they don't have the background of, I would say, almost 90 years of broadcasting with the team that we have here that they do. Right. And everybody says that they're a podcast aficionado or creator. And then when you start digging further, you say, okay, you're going to charge X amount of dollars, but the product you're putting out, those are short dollars in my eyes because A, they're not doing a service. They're doing a disservice to the customers, but they're also doing a disservice to teams like Podcast Village because it's such a gray area. And it reminds me of the time when everybody wanted an app, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody was an app developer. And there was different levels of apps where some were just skin, some were essentially web apps, and some were native. And I sat here and I said, how do you fight this? And there's really no way to fight it except for to concentrate on your level and stay in your lane and make sure that your reputation stays in place.
So when you say, but as you look to the future and how this scales and how podcasting scales, is there going to be, so you mentioned those are like name brands, big Fortune 500 companies that would be creating podcasts. So it sounds like you're saying that kind of the table stakes are going to be that a lot of brands have a podcast aligned with them.
Yes.
But do you think from understanding the market, do people want to consume podcasts almost as an extension of advertising for that brand, or is it they want really unique content like a Serial or a Bootstrapped or This American Life or an NPR, all those things? How do you see that kind of in the market?
That's absolutely fair, right? So let's take two examples. One, I can speak freely about this because there's nothing under contract, no NDA. but
you're the editor, so
yes, the Smithsonian.
Yeah. Okay.
I was connected with a gentleman who used to work in the gemology department, and he had heard about the projects we've done in the past, and he said, "Do you mind meeting for lunch?" The lunch turned into a 5-hour tour of the gemology side of this. The Natural History Museum, and I am in 3 or 4 different vaults where all of these gems are there, and the gentleman that's curating this exhibit is asking me, like, what do you think is a great story here? And I said, I think all of these are great stories. I said,
see lots of shiny
but
ones.
you have to decide what type of show you want to create, and a lot of people don't know that.
Right.
And then at the end of the 4-hour lunch, which was essentially a tour, I asked him, what's a story you tell your grandkids? And he told me a story that blew my mind. And I said, that's your podcast. You tell those stories. You tell the stories about the trade craft, on how you move your gems, or you moved them in the 80s and 90s, and nobody knew that it was on the train, and everybody thought it was in an armored vehicle in 95. Like, those
So, for
are
example,
fun stories.
got it. So it's that way for, so to use your Capital One example, Capital One might also, not telling stories about how can you open a checking account, but they might provide information on cryptocurrencies,
network security,
or how the mint works to print dollars, or how the banking system works, or something like that.
The idea that they're not just, they're more than a bank now, that they're a technology company, right? And so whether I have another customer that comes in, and essentially she wants to create a series of videos to vet certain clients, where she says, I get the same questions, I walk down the same path, it's 4 or 5 hours figuring out what this client wants, so I want to create a series of video podcasts that explain everything anyone needs to know about this type of project. Mm-hmm. And then after they watch those, if they call me, then I know they're serious about the business.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is education, training, onboarding, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's all of those things. And because this is such an accessible medium, everybody's got smartphones, everybody can download a podcast. It's just accepted. I mean, I don't know about you, Alana, but my students are asking me, like, do we have to read this chapter in this textbook? Right. Can't you just let me listen to a podcast?
Yes, why? Yes, we can. We have one right for you.
Well, and you're using it in that same manner, where you can take your curriculum and say, you listen to this episode, and then we will discuss this at the next time we meet, right?
Absolutely. Total flipping of the classroom using podcasts. I mean, I think that,
So if we have a listener that's listening to this and they're thinking about joining Podcast Village, tell us more about kind of what the type of client that would be a good fit. How would they learn more about it? I mean, they should listen to this episode. Clearly, they already are, but what else should they do? You can write me directly at oscar@podcastvillage.com. Even if you just want to talk about and want to understand a little bit more about what a podcast is, we can continue that conversation. If you have a home studio and you want to find out what type of mics we use here, we share all of that. But more importantly, we just want great people here that want to create. We have an offline motto that I'll say online is we have a strict no a-hole policy.
Okay.
Like, when you're here, you collaborate, you create, you respect, and if you continue to do that, we will help you be as successful as possible within your own realm.
And so do you see Podcast Village expanding to other locations around DC? Or you mentioned that you're almost sold out. What do you see as the scalable model?
So the scalable model, and as far as runway is concerned, so we're in February 5th, right, of 2018, depending on when this drops. We are remodeling the studio in Gaithersburg. Okay. Tomorrow, I am going to visit with an old colleague and friend of mine for a possible studio in Clarendon, which is in Virginia. Ideally, we want to be able to replicate this model across the country, but not take on too much risk, right? So we have a model. We think that it's pretty rock solid as far as our network and our team members in place. Mm-hmm. But ideally, we're going to make sure that this works here in Georgetown in Clarendon, in Gaithersburg before we scale up. But to a man, everyone says, if you want to own the space, move fast.
Well, Oscar, we have been thrilled to be able to work with you on this podcast, but also to see like Podcast Village, here in Georgetown come alive. So we're kind of excited to be part of this process and can't wait to see where things go over the next couple of years.
I can't thank you and the Dingman Center and the Smith School of Business for all the support that you've shown me. I remember sitting there when and not even in your office, but when I was just applying, and there are multiple schools in the area you can apply to. And when Professor Schimmel said to me, what's your greatest weakness? I said, well, I feel like sometimes I'm taken advantage of because I'm too nice. And then he said, read this book called Give and Take by Adam Grant. I read it. And then he interviewed me again. I don't think he thought I was going to read it. And he said, we will teach you how to use your goodwill and your talents and not feel like you're being taken advantage of, but feel like you're doing the work you should be doing. So with that.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Well, we are so proud of you, Oscar, and what you've built here and everything like that. And I do remember when you first kind of started the class that Alana and I were teaching on entrepreneurship, you had this idea. You wanted to work on this idea. And we did push you a little bit to think about having some teammates and thinking about sharing that.
Yes.
Frankly, I think at first you were reluctant to do it, but you did it. And part of it was that you are somebody who shares, who welcomes people into this. You believe very much in the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats.
Yes.
So anyway, I just want to say I'm so proud of you.
Yeah, you can't. Well, again, you can't do it yourself, right? And that we're all not quants or qualitatives. Like if you know what you're great at, and you know what you're not great at, find the people that are great at what you're not great at and team up with them for any business.
Yeah, and this is this Bootstrap podcast has been a great example of that, because we knew nothing about podcasting, and I think this is our 40th or 41st or something like that episode. So
now
so anyone listening,
now you have a TV show.
Now we're currently on TV too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Thanks to Oscar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar.
Thank you.
Now we will talk about Oscar while he's listening to us talk about Oscar. So this was actually, we've been wanting to do this episode with Oscar for some time, and this seemed like really the perfect time to sit here in the new Podcast Village as we've seen all the equipment come in and the studios being built. It's kind of been as we've teased, a startup within a startup within, I think, a startup. So I think it is really interesting to be sitting here and be kind of thinking back on the journey that we've had and watch Oscar as an entrepreneur. It's really exciting to see somebody take their unfair advantage, which we talk about often, and use his skill set, understanding the technology, understanding content, understanding marketing, and also really leveraging his network to put this all together. And it's great to see how it's coming together.
But Alana, that you and I come here and we see some of the tactical things that Oscar has done to build up this space, to kind of talk about the stories of the different clients that he's bringing on. But I mean, I just love this opportunity to sit and kind of talk at a more strategic level about Podcast Village. Clearly, Oscar has an unfair advantage in this space. Mm-hmm. But the fact that he gives so much, I mean, there's no selfish bone in Oscar's body as far as I can tell, and he wants to include people, and I think he's built a business model that kind of plays to that strength as well.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that he's also able, and which is really hard when you're in the weeds and you're running wires under us as we're getting ready and getting all the video and the cameras set up, to also be thinking at a 30,000-foot view of the role that podcasting will play in media and advertising and content going forward, and to be a thought leader on that. I think that that's a role that he also plays, is kind of spreading the gospel about what podcasting is, all the limited possibilities, which are just all the unlimited possibilities, and kind of seeding the ideas to everybody of what podcasts they could be doing, and thinking about themselves as podcasters.
From my perspective, as somebody who loves technology and thinking about the wave that podcasting is enjoying right now, there's a few things I think that gave Oscar that unfair advantage. But the other thing is the fact that you have a sense of kind of humility as you approach this new technology and embrace it, as opposed to try to hunker down and kind of try to avoid it. And so I think you should be complimented on that tremendously. And Now, when so many people have launched podcasts, he's kind of recognizing that it's not just about doing it to get it up there, because anybody can maybe have a podcast and have it downloadable, but to actually have one that's quality, to have one that's consistent with the message. There's a lot of kind of back and forth and working with the clients necessary to make that happen.
Yeah, and some clients, probably us included, aren't always that easy to deal with.
Now, when Oscar first came to us, come on, be honest, do you think he was buttering us up for a better grade?
I don't know.
Oh,
I don't
that's
know.
totally my
You
first
think
move.
so?
Oh my goodness, Oscar comes to us and say, "You guys have great content in class.
Right,
you should have a podcast."
I want to share your knowledge. You're right. We were buttered up. It worked.
Yeah,
Thanks,
it wasn't until the grade was in the books and indelible that we went ahead and said, all right, maybe Oscar really is onto something. And it's been a fun ride. So thank you, Oscar, not only for sharing your story with all of our listeners today, but for all that you do for Bootstrapped to make it successful.
And so that wraps another great episode of Bootstrapped, a Dingman Center podcast. I'm Ilana Fine. You can follow me at Ilana Fine on Twitter and the Dingman Center at UMD_Dingman.
And I'm Joe Bailey. You can follow me on Twitter at Joseph P. Bailey. Thank you very much to all of our listeners, to our wonderful Smith community, and a wonderful alumni like Oscar. And for those listeners who are excited about entrepreneurship, we encourage all of you to bootstrap your next venture.